Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about holiness in the Euthyphro. And this is one of the ways we're going to get at an understanding of the ancient Greek view of what we call religion. And of course, in ancient Greece, they didn't have a word for religion, nothing that we could translate with the word religion. Clearly, they had and did many of the things that we associate with religion. And so we saw some of that in Oedipus and in Antigone. So the gods make things better or worse for them. The gods give them commands and they execute those commands. Sometimes they misunderstand them. The gods expect certain things of them, and if they do them, then it's good for them, and if they don't, then it's bad for them. So we know that they have all of these things, but there's no word religion that they use to describe that. Nevertheless, they have many of these practices, and so their concept, it's important for us to remember that their understanding of what they were doing is a little bit different from our understanding of what we do with modern religion, and also a little bit different from our understanding of religion as a thing that we're studying. And one of the reasons that I like to start with the Greeks in this class is precisely this difference, that there's not the same self-consciousness about religion as a category among the Greeks. There is just reverence or piety. There are gods, and there are the things you do with the gods. And so there's no debate about whether religion is true or false. There might be, or whether this religion is true and that religion is false. There are different beliefs in different gods, and people might reject some gods and worship others, although, of course, in ancient Greece, generally there's a tradition of the gods who are there and the gods who matter. But since there's no scripture, and this is all in the earlier lecture on Greek religion, no scripture, no social institutions that are unified in the ancient Greek world. So there's a lot of variety. But also it means that we can't just go to the scriptures. We can't just go to ritual handbooks or whatever. If we want to understand religion in general, we need to get into the ways that it expresses itself elsewhere in culture and not just in scripture. And that's one of the reasons that I don't start with scripture in this class. Because religiosity, even if it takes a scriptural component seriously, expresses itself everywhere else. And so one of the things we want to see is, how do people express their religious views or enact their understanding of their relation to the divine, to put it in James' terms, in other ways? And so these kinds of stories give us ways of thinking about the varieties of expression of religious belief and religious experience. And so religion expresses itself in art, including sculpture, painting, and other things, in literature, and also, as with Plato, in philosophy and philosophical literature. So Sophocles in Oedipus and Antigone gives us a sense of the way that people thought the gods fit into their lives. Euthyphro, the Platonic dialogue Euthyphro, is an explicit reflection on the way human beings organize their lives around the gods, and an explicit reflection on the way human beings orient themselves in terms of the gods. And remember, I used that metaphor of a compass when we talked about William James. And so here in Euthyphro, we're going to get a more self-conscious reflection on the status of what we call religion. So Socrates, of course, is the hero of the Platonic dialogues. Socrates himself wrote nothing. We have no writings from Socrates at all. He spent all his time arguing with people like he does with poor Euthyphro. He had a group of students around him. You're going to see one of them in Crito, a guy named Crito. Most famously, Plato, who is the main source of what we know about Socrates. But of course, Plato had his own views, and so we get sort of Plato's version of Socrates. And then, of course, Plato has his most famous student is Aristotle, who famously disagreed with Plato about a number of things. But Alfred North Whitehead famously says at the beginning of the 20th century that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. And what he meant by that is that Plato defines what it means to do philosophy in the Western world for the last 2,300, 2,400 years. And Socrates is at the heart of that. And so Socrates, we can think of, even though we talk about pre-Socratic philosophers, Socrates is really the beginning of what, for millennia, we in the West have thought about what it means to do philosophy. And what it means to do philosophy is to examine. And so famously, Socrates states that the unexamined life is not worth living. And you're going to see actually a version of this in the Apology. And so we're going to wonder what examination is. And we're going to think about this not only in this dialogue, because he's going to examine Euthyphro, but also in the Apology and then in the Crito, because there will be examinations there as well. Examination, of course, meaning asking questions, right? And so the idea of the examined life, which is what he's going to call in the Apology the philosophic life, is the idea of taking ourselves seriously and using our ability to reason to determine how best to live better lives. And so the goal of this inquiry, the goal of examination, the goal of being philosophical, is to live the good life. And what we mean here by the good life is both a morally good life, but also in part as a result of living a morally or ethically good life, that we live a more fulfilled life, right? And so the good life is not about, wine, women, and song, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The good life is about contentment in the best things. Fulfillment is even better than contentment. Fulfillment, to be fulfilled, which doesn't necessarily mean you get done doing it, but you always feel like you're living your best life. And so at the heart of this is Socrates. So let's look at this dialogue, Euthyphro, in particular. There are 4 key things to keep in mind. 3 of these, I think, are critical issues or contexts for us. One, of course, is going to be holiness or piety, which here are the same thing. We'll talk about that word in a minute. Justice. And so for Socrates, always, the most important thing Socrates seems to be concerned with is justice. And that's then going to be related to his understanding of truth. And so when we know what truth is, we can figure out what it means to be a good person. And so he's concerned in the search for the search for truth in order to figure out how to live a better life. And then, of course, we want to think about family. And the issue in this dialogue, which you must know by now, is that Euthyphro is bringing his own father, up on charges of murder for essentially accidental death of someone who had deliberately killed someone in his household, right? And so Euthyphro then, so in a certain sense, Euthyphro's father could be understood as protecting someone inside the household. And Euthyphro goes and brings his father up on charges. And so he's, in a sense, attacking someone inside the household. And not even just anyone inside, not a slave, as in the case of his father, but his own father. And so this really should bring to mind Sophocles then, right? Because Oedipus is in trouble for having killed his father, which is a horrible crime. And that's what Oedipus the king is all about. And then, of course, Antigone and her insistence on burying her brother, and Creon, who you may recall, is very concerned that he not look like he's playing favorites with Antigone. And so he says, even though she's in fact, especially because she's a member of the family, I need to make sure that I don't let her off the hook because everyone will think I'm playing favorites. And so instead of taking care of someone in the family, he is more determined to prosecute her. And then, of course, we need to keep in mind the court context of this, that the conversation takes place in the context of Euthyphro's court case and Socrates' impending court case, which is what we're going to get a glimpse of in the next dialogue, the Apology. So let's talk a minute about Socratic method. We've mentioned examination already. And so what it means for Socrates to do philosophy is to examine. And what he's going to say in the Apology, which you may have seen already, I hope, is that what it means to live the philosophic life is to examine myself and others. And by examine, we mean to ask questions in a search for the truth. So Socrates will often engage in what is known as Socratic irony, and he does this exactly in the text with Euthyphro. And by irony, we mean here Socratic irony specifically will be his taking the position of not knowing and acknowledging someone else as an expert, when in fact that person is not an expert. And this is exactly what Socrates does with Euthyphro. Euthyphro says, I'm an expert on holiness. And Socrates says, well, since you know so much, clearly I can learn from you. And proceeds then to examine Euthyphro. This is what we mean by Socratic irony. Not that Socrates knows necessarily more than Euthyphro does, but he knows, or at least strongly suspects, that Euthyphro doesn't know as much as Euthyphro says he does. And so Socrates puts himself in the position of the student and then questions his interlocutor. The idea of Socratic elenchus or elenchus is the strategy of leading your opponent into a contradiction. And so you get them to state something clearly and plainly, and then you ask them questions about that thing until eventually, in the process of trying to explain what they said the first time, they say something that is a total contradiction of what they said the first time. And we're going to see this happen with Euthyphro also. You might even, if you're thinking about this, you might know exactly where it happens. Finally, as we've said, he's concerned to pursue the truth. That's the purpose of examination. But the point of truth is to learn how to live the good life. And so it's not truth for the sake of truth, and just sort of possession of knowledge, and then it's done. Your knowledge is supposed to express itself in the ability to make good decisions in the world, to know what the just things are, to be able to be just. And so in the case of Euthyphro, to be able to make the right decision about whether or not you pursue a court case against your father, for example. Or if you're Socrates, should you in fact continue to ask people questions? Is that actually the just thing to do? Is it perhaps even the pious thing to do? And the apology is going to be a lot about that. Now we should notice that this distinguishes Socrates from his famous enemies, the sophists. And the word sophist is from, you'll notice that it's similar to the word philosophy. They both have at their root this word sophia, meaning wisdom. And so philosophia, is the love of wisdom, the pursuit of wisdom. The sophists are so called because they're kind of wisdomists, you might say. And so sophistry is the idea of arguing to win, not to find the truth. And the sophists famously charged for lessons, and their goals were simply to teach their students how to win, period. And so, at least on Plato's take on the sophists, they're the exact opposite of what Socrates is about. Socrates does not get paid for what he does, and his questioning is not about winning anything. His questioning is about finding the truth. And so he distinguishes himself explicitly from the sophists early in the Apology, who are not concerned with truth, but only with winning. The dialogue in question, this is the Euthyphro that we're looking at right now, is an example of what's called an aporetic dialogue, because we are left with an aporia at the end. And this is a fancy Greek way of saying an impasse or the lack of an answer. And so if you've read the dialogue now, which I hope you have, you've probably been very, very frustrated because you go through all of these arguments back and forth, and you come down at the end, and you still don't have an answer to the question, what is piety? What is holiness? Is what Euthyphro is doing the right thing to do? Is it the pious thing to do? And so the dialogue expresses the anxiety of trying to figure out the answers to these very critical questions. And at the very end of the dialogue, when Euthyphro runs off, we can kind of see the impact of Socrates having exposed his ignorance. That is, that now he knows that he's been acting on a sense of holiness that he can't justify. He can't even explain, much less justify what he's doing. And so we're left at the end without an answer. But this is really important because part of what's at stake for Socrates is that when you think you know the answer, like Euthyphro at the beginning of the dialogue, then you don't have anything to learn. You don't look for ways to learn because you already know the answers. And so the aporetic exercise is a really important exercise in preparing yourself to actually make genuine progress in learning. And so you'll see in the course of the dialogue that Socrates even employs the metaphor of a labyrinth and compares Euthyphro to Daedalus. Daedalus being the ancient Greek inventor, architect, all-around really smart and creative guy, sort of like the ancient version of Leonardo da Vinci, who, famously built the labyrinth, a maze, and this is, by the way, is a maze with no. There are lots of dead ends in the labyrinth, and that's one of the points of the labyrinth, is that it's supposed to be a kind of prison for the Minotaur, who's half man, half bull. And so a labyrinth is a place where you get lost. You go down paths that look like they might get you somewhere, and you find yourself staring at a wall, and you have to turn around and go back. Lots of dead ends, lots of switchbacks. And that's what's happening to Socrates in this dialogue, and that's why he compares Euthyphro to Daedalus, because Euthyphro's explanations are like a labyrinth. You're walking down a path, and you realize you've gotten nowhere. And that's, in fact, exactly what happens in the whole dialogue, is that it's like a labyrinth. And reading the dialogue, for us as readers, we negotiate that labyrinth along with Socrates. And since we have the opportunity to reflect on what's written, we can actually see some potential clues we can maybe find that Ariadne's thread that we could follow out of the labyrinth, even if Euthyphro doesn't, and he doesn't. But the dialogue then models a certain kind of examination, a certain kind of inquiry. And really, Euthyphro should have been asking himself the questions that Socrates asks him, even before Socrates asks him those questions. So Socrates examines Euthyphro. He puts himself in the position of being a student. Remember that they're outside the courtroom, right? Or essentially it's sort of the courthouse in ancient Athens. And Euthyphro is coming out, and Socrates is coming out, and they run into each other, and it looks like they've got something to talk about. The trial of Euthyphro's father and the coming trial of Socrates on charges of impiety. And so Euthyphro claims that prosecuting his father is a pious thing to do, and that what his father did was an impious or unholy thing to do. And so we need to keep in mind that these examinations have real-world implications. So the decisions about what's pious, what's just, or whatever have to do with, whether or not Euthyphro's father is going to die. They have to do with whether or not Socrates is going to die. And you must know by now that he does, as a result of this trial. And so their discussions about these things are not just sort of theoretical. They're about who's going to live in the world and how they're going to live in the world. So piety is what's at the heart of the dialogue. And this is going to be our sort of wedge into, or our sort of foot in the door on Greek understandings of religion, especially sort of classical Athens, which is where the drama takes place, and it's where Socrates was from, it's where Plato was from. And so these terms piety and holiness are different. They essentially they're the same. They translate the same Greek word, hasios, which can also be translated reverence. And so, for example, you see this in Antigone when she says, "I will be a criminal, but a pious one." It's that same word, hasios. And we're going to use that as a way of thinking about religiosity or religious attitudes, right? So a pious attitude or a pious act or a holy act, right, is going to be the way we're going to think about ancient Greek concepts of what we think of as religion. And so I'm going to use both words, piety and holiness, but recognize that they're the same Greek term. They're the same term in the text. Not different words, not different concepts. And so, of course, then this matters for Oedipus, and when we connect with Oedipus and Antigone, because piety has to do not just with your relationship to the gods, but then also it's going to get wrapped up in the family. And so Oedipus is in trouble for killing his father. Antigone is trying to bury her brother because it's it's a pious job to bury her brother specifically. And so it's her job and no one else's job to do. Arguably Creon. But then, of course, remember that Creon takes the position that as the head of state, he's supposed to pretend he doesn't have a family. And that's what gets him in trouble in the play Antigone. And so the hearth, here is the idea we want. The hearth is the fire at the center of the home. You'd use it for cooking. You would sit around it. And so hearth is a way of talking about home. So someone who's sitting at your hearth is someone who's within your home. And they might be a member of the family, or they might be a visitor, and you've taken them in as a guest at the hearth. And that's going to be very important in ancient Greek culture, and it's going to be important in ancient biblical culture, and we're going to see it again when we talk about Abraham and Isaac. And especially Sodom and Gomorrah, because the real issue with Sodom and Gomorrah is their treatment of strangers. This is so important in Greek culture that there's even a goddess of the hearth, Hestia. Right? So it's assigned a particular religious importance, the hearth, the home, the family. And so that's one of the things we're going to be trying to get at, is how does piety relate specifically to your understanding of your relationship with your family? What are the obligations you have towards family? So Socrates asks Euthyphro, what is piety? Euthyphro, having claimed, remember, to be an expert, and in fact he's so much of an expert that he doesn't send to the interpreter. And remember, I talked about interpreters in the previous lecture. And he even tells us, Euthyphro tells us at the beginning of the dialogue, that his father sent for the interpreter to try to decide what to do with the murderer. But the murderer dies before the interpreter comes back. So the father sends off to the interpreter, but Euthyphro feels no need to do that. So he clearly understands himself to have a better understanding of these things than most people. So Socrates says, well, what's piety? Tell me. And over the course of the dialogue, we get 3 different answers, all of which fail. But we get 3 different attempts from Euthyphro to explain what piety is. First he says, piety is prosecuting my father and other things like that. Then, when that doesn't hold up, he says, well, piety is what pleases the gods. The things that the gods approve of, those are the things that are pious. And then when that one falls apart, he says, well, taking care of the gods, doing the will of the gods in exchange for rewards. And conversely, to avoid curses or punishments. And so if you do the will of the gods, like burying your brother, then you don't bring a plague on the city. Right? So there's a certain model of exchange there. So these are the 3 answers over the course of the dialogue that we get from Euthyphro. Let's look at them in a little more detail, each of these 3. The first try, it turns out, and Socrates points this out, he says, this is not a definition, these are examples of pious things. What I want from you, Euthyphro, is the definition. I want you to give me an idea of piety. And so you may have heard of the Platonic ideas or Platonic forms. That's kind of what he means here. What's the sort of the idea abstracted from concrete examples? What is it about all of those different examples that makes each of them holy? And if I know what that idea is, the idea of holiness or the idea of piety, then I can go about my life looking at any particular act or any particular thing I might say, and I can take that idea and I can apply it to that act, and I can know whether that act is holy or not. So what we're looking for is a definition which will express the essence of the concept of holiness, so that then I can take that off and take that and live my life with it. Well, curiously, one of the ways that Euthyphro puts this is he says, one must not let off the perpetrator of an impiety, whoever he should happen to be. And he says, not only does it not matter if that person is at my hearth, that is to say, in my family or a guest under my protection, but in fact, the duty is even more mine if that person is at my hearth than if he were out there or a stranger. Someone at my hearth is my responsibility. I need to clean up that pollution. And so family doesn't matter. What's right matters, not family. And here that sounds to us like what we might expect from a philosopher. That's what we might expect from someone like Socrates. To say, so for just a minute, Euthyphro's got to think that he's saying what he thinks Socrates wants to hear. That truth and justice are independent of family. Piety is independent of family. They're about what's right and wrong. And that's got nothing to do with family. So it's curious. On the one hand, he's very traditional, elevating the gods and saying that whatever they do is good. And so he uses the example of Zeus, right? Zeus killed his father. So, it must be all right for me to prosecute my father. It's very traditional. On the other hand, he's denigrating the family, in a sense. And that's not traditional at all. So Euthyphro is doing something just a little bit strange here. And then, of course, keep in mind Creon, because this is very similar to what Creon does, right? Creon says, it's especially important that I not let Antigone off the hook because I can't show favoritism. And so here Euthyphro sounds a little bit like Creon. And if that makes you think that Euthyphro is probably on the wrong side, then you're right. So then so this falls apart, and Euthyphro admits that it's not even a definition. So fine, he gives another go. And eventually, he says, Socrates actually formulates this for him. He says that what the gods approve of, or what pleases the gods, is holy, and what doesn't is unholy. And so Socrates puts it this way: what all the gods disapprove of, because of course we know the gods can disagree. This is a problem with the ancient Greek gods, and it's one that Socrates didn't approve of. But Socrates throws him a bone and says, let's imagine that we can get them to agree on things. What all the gods disapprove of is unholy, and what they all approve of is holy. And then maybe there's some stuff that is neither or both, depending on how you think about it. And so the question here then is, how can you know, Euthyphro, if the gods disapprove of your father's accidental murder of a man in his household? And how can you know, so much so that they want his persecution? And how could you know then, conversely, that the gods approve your prosecution? And so this leads us to the question of why the gods approve and disapprove of things, right? How is it that Euthyphro could possibly know this? And what Socrates wants to say is that you can only know this if you understand what holiness is. And so Socrates asks him, and here's going to be the contradiction. This is what's going to lead us into the contradiction. So what's holy is what the gods approve. Why do the gods approve of things? What is it about holy actions or holy people that makes them holy in the eyes of the gods? And so the critical question comes at 10a in the text. It's page 20 in your translation. Is the holy approved by the gods because it's holy? Or is it holy because it's approved? So in other words, does the god declaring that murder is wrong, is it wrong because God declares it? Or is it wrong and God declares it to be wrong because God knows it's wrong? And this is the question that Socrates is really trying to unpack here. And it matters in the history of the philosophy of religion. It's very important because it addresses a central ethical concern in religious ethics, what's called divine command theory. Divine command theory is the idea that ethical things are ethical, or moral things are moral, because God commands them. So it is God's command that makes good things good and bad things bad. God does not decide what's good and bad based on any external standard. He determines from within himself what is right and what is wrong. And so, of course, the problem with this, the most obvious problem, there are several, but the most obvious problem is if God determines right and wrong by no standard of right and wrong, other than God's own will, then there's no reason why God couldn't declare murder to be acceptable tomorrow. And then it would be good. And then morality would be good. Because God's command is what makes it good. So if God commands you to kill people, then it's good because God commanded it. And I think what most of us would say is, well, murdering people is wrong, and therefore God would not command it. And so what Socrates is after here is to say that Euthyphro is turning this upside down. And so what Socrates wants to say is, the gods actually know what holiness is, and they judge holy things holy based on their knowledge of holiness. But that means that knowing the gods approve of something doesn't actually tell us what holiness is. What we want to know is why they approve of those things. If they call holy things holy because they're holy, then what we really want to know is what it is about those things that makes them holy. We want to know what holiness is. And so saying the gods approve of it doesn't actually help us. And so on the one hand, notice on the previous slide, the definition we had was that holy is what's divinely approved and unholy is what's not divinely approved or divinely disapproved. And finally, at the end, here we get the contradiction. The divinely approved is not holy, and the holy is not divinely approved. But in fact, they're totally different things. And so Socrates has led Euthyphro into a contradiction. And we've seen not only that he contradicts himself, but that in fact, approval and holiness are different things that work different ways. And so trying to define holiness by approval doesn't actually tell us anything, either about approval or about holiness. So we need another definition. Here we get a brief interlude because Socrates tries to help out Euthyphro. And you probably detect a kind of sarcastic tone from Socrates in this dialogue. And I find it difficult to argue with that. But he really is trying to help Euthyphro, not just embarrass him. And here, at this part, he's giving him a hint. He says, Euthyphro, what if we think that holiness and justice are related somehow? What is the nature of the relationship between holiness and justice? And if we can figure that out, then we might have a way of coming at holiness in terms of justice. It would give us a foothold, right? It would give us some markers to orient ourselves by, right? So if we take the compass metaphor again, it might give us the position of the sun. And so we know that way is west and this other way is the other way. It would help us if we know what the relationship is between holiness and justice. And the answer, of course, is that holiness is a kind of justice. So think of it this way, that there are the set of all just things, all just acts. That's the green circle. So all just things are inside that green circle. And holiness, as some kind of aspect of justice, is going to be inside the green circle, right? So the blue circle of holiness, all holy things will be just things. Everything holy is just. So everything, even if we hang on to the approval idea, everything approved by the gods as holy is going to be just by definition. Okay, that's great. But what it also means is, if we can figure out what justice is, we know that holiness is a kind of justice. Then we just have to figure out what kind or what aspect, maybe, of justice holiness is. And so Euthyphro, to his credit, he detects that this is a hint, and he tries to give us a definition in that direction. So quickly to recap, since justice is connected to holiness in this way, then justice can help us understand what holiness is. And somehow, justice will help us understand what it means to be pious. Secondly, religiosity, as we understand it as piety or holiness, is going to be somehow essentially concerned with justice. We're not going to be able to understand holiness without understanding justice. And I'm going to argue, in part really with this class, that religion in general is concerned with justice, and it comes at it from different ways. But we can't, I would argue, really understand religion if we don't understand justice as part of it. And we see this articulated beautifully in this couple of pages in Euthyphro. And by the way, by implication, if you're always just, then you're not going to do something the gods don't approve, right? Because all of the things the gods approve are sort of contained within justice. And while the gods' particular holy aspects pertaining to the gods, or rather particular just things that don't pertain to the gods might not be considered holy. And so, drinking a cup of coffee may not be considered holy, but it wouldn't be considered unjust. Or, helping someone across the street may be just without being holy. But if you keep yourself being just, then you're going to hit that holiness sweet spot, right? So let's come to Euthyphro's third try. Here, finally, he says, okay, I'm going to take the hint, and I'm going to try to frame it in terms of justice. And we're going to see Abraham do this when he negotiates with God about Sodom. So keep this in mind for Genesis 19 down the road. So here he is Euthyphro is trying to put his ill-formed conception of holiness in terms of justice. And so he says, okay, and this seems like the obvious thing, right? That if holiness, remember those circles, and you can scrub back if you need to and look at that again. But the obvious way to think about holiness as an aspect of justice is to say, well, if justice is the sort of just treatment of people, then holiness as an aspect of justice will be just treatment of the gods. So we treat the gods justly. That's what it means to be holy, is to be just to the gods, to act justly with respect to the gods. Unfortunately, Euthyphro takes this, what I think is the wrong direction. And you need to keep this in mind for the apology, because remember that Socrates declares himself to be doing the work of the god somehow. But here, the way Euthyphro talks about it is the care of the gods, tending to the gods, serving the gods, looking after the gods, classically offering food to the gods, right? So animal offerings or grain and wine offerings. And even in one of the famous stories of hospitality in Greek literature, the goddess Demeter hides because her daughter Persephone, has been stolen by the god Hades to marry her. And so Demeter, the goddess of, that's Demeter, Demeter, the goddess of grain and harvest, and she goes into hiding, and she's actually taken care of by a local family. And it's a great example of hospitality because they don't know who she is. She's in disguise. They don't know who she is, and they take care of her. And she eventually rewards them for this, even though they make her mad at a certain point. They get rewarded for this. But meanwhile, since she's in hiding, none of the crops are growing on the earth. And the gods on Mount Olympus start getting irritated or actually even concerned, because now that humans have no food, there's nothing for them to give to the gods, right? And so here, Euthyphro has, in a certain sense, again, still a very traditional understanding that what we do as human beings is make offerings to the gods. And so he calls it at a certain point the science of requests and donations to the gods. It's a science because there's a kind of economy to it, right? And you learn how to give them the right things to get what you want. So you give them little things, you might get little things. You give them big things that they really want, and you might get big things you really want. And so there's an economy. Religion is basically an economic transaction, or spiritual economic system on this understanding. And so we might get things like success or health or wealth, or our wagon might get fixed. But then the question is, what is it that the gods get from us? Or what is it that they accomplish through us? And if they're gods, right, the question really is, why do they need us to do anything? And Socrates asks him this, like, if the gods are gods, what could I possibly have and give to them that they don't already have? So Euthyphro says, well, he can't say that they get fed, because that seems kind of silly, even though it's surely part of what he's thinking. It seems silly that the gods would starve if they didn't have us. So he doesn't say that. Instead, he says, well, the gods are gratified. It makes them feel good, our gifts. It makes them feel awesome, presumably about themselves, right? That all these people are giving them all these awesome things. And so he says, well, so the stuff we give the gods is the stuff that gratifies them. Well, Euthyphro, what gratifies the gods? Well, obviously the things that the gods approve. Wait a second. We just had this conversation about approving and disapproving. And so it turns out that the way Euthyphro frames his third attempt is basically a different version of his second attempt. And we know that the second attempt led to nothing, didn't get us anywhere. And so what's happened is we've found out that he's just taken his second attempt, and he's taken Socrates' hint, justice. And he says, okay, I'm going to take that one and make it sound like justice. But in fact, when we scratch the surface, we see that beneath it, it's the same stuff and is just as unsatisfactory. And so here we are now, right back where we started at the dialogue, and this is the aporia. This is the what's called an impasse. I-M-P-A-S-S-E. There's no answer to the question. Euthyphro gets frustrated, probably actually embarrassed, and runs away. Because he's at the point where he's finally going to have to admit that he has no idea what he's talking about. And all Socrates did, I mean, honestly, Socrates talks circles around him. But we need to remember, however much you might be inclined to dislike Socrates after this dialogue, you need to remember that Euthyphro kind of asked for it. And so when Socrates sees him at the beginning of the dialogue, Euthyphro is talking about holiness. And he says, you know, I'm bringing my father up on charges. And Socrates says, wow, why would you do such a thing as that? You must really know what you're talking about if you're going to bring your father up on charges. And Euthyphro says, you're darn right I do, Socrates. I know exactly what I'm doing. I know all about this stuff. And he even talks about how he prophesies at the assemblies. And so Euthyphro, we need to remember, is kind of arrogant. And where he is at the end, and this is what happens with bullies when you push them, he runs away because he's got nothing. That's really the way to think of Euthyphro here. He's embarrassed, but the truth is that he embarrassed himself. And so he's dancing with Socrates, but the one who's tripping over his own feet is Euthyphro. And Socrates can move. And so a few concluding observations, and then we'll be done. Notice we begin to get a sense of Socrates' view of the gods. And so he's messing around a little bit with this traditional view of the gods as adulterers and rapists and petty criminals, which is a lot of the way that murderers, killing their parents, taking whatever they want from whomever they want, view of the gods that we get from a lot of the ancient literature. Socrates is starting to push back a little bit, it seems like, in Euthyphro. We see much, much more of this in Apology, where he essentially claims in the Apology that part of what it means to be a god is to be rational and just, by definition. And so, on that understanding, stories about Zeus turning into a rain shower and raping someone is not an accurate view of Zeus on Socrates' understanding. And so Socrates in the Apology much more clearly rejects these traditional views of the gods. Euthyphro himself has, in some really important respects, a very traditional understanding of the gods. And that's why he can go to Zeus, who attacks his own father and drags his siblings out of his father's stomach because his father has eaten them. Right? So Arguably, you could be the father and eat your children on Euthyphro's understanding, or you could be the son and attack your father. And so Euthyphro has this very traditional understanding of the gods, and he has not thought through what it means to associate the gods with justice yet. We see how the examined life works in this dialogue. Euthyphro should have thought about these things before he brought his father up on charges. Now, the court case is going. And Euthyphro, so convinced that he's so right, has acted before he thought about what he was doing. And so when Socrates talks about living the examined life, he's talking about figuring out what the truth is so that you can know whether that's the right thing to do or not. And so the dialogue that they have is a dialogue, Euthyphro very well could have and should have had with himself. But if he couldn't, he should have gone to Socrates or someone else and tried to work it out before he decided what to do. And then finally, the other thing is holiness, the relationship between holiness and the family. Right? Family is going to be a critical part of holiness, and probably for Socrates, a really important part of thinking about justice. And you're going to want to think carefully about how Socrates understands himself, or in relation to his family. Because in the Crito, we're going to see that, Crito argues with Socrates that he should keep himself alive by sneaking off into exile in order to take care of his family. And Socrates says that's not the right way to take care of my family. So there's something about holiness in the family that syncs up with our conversations about Oedipus, Antigone, and Creon. But also, as we're going to see next week, especially with the Crito. Thank you.